Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's virtual event where we'll be assessing the European Green Deal 1 year in. My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based in Brussels, and I'm coming at you live from the Euractiv studios in the heart of the EU quarter. And this is a big week for climate anniversaries. Today marks the 1 year anniversary of the EU Green Deal put forward by Ursula von der Leyen. The new president when she was the new president of the European Commission 1 year ago, was her first signature act, and it has been one of the defining policies of her commission. And on Saturday, we have the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And to mark that occasion, leaders of several countries are going to come together to assess where we are now at a global level. So we've got a lot of anniversaries. It's a good time to reflect on how far we've come and what remains to be done, which is a lot. Now, the initial climate action initiative that was put forward 1 year ago, and then the follow-up action that came in January of this year. The initiatives included the European Climate Law to enshrine the 2050 climate neutrality objective into EU law, the European Climate Pact just put forward to engage citizens in all parts of society in climate action, and the 2030 climate target plan to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is where the Commission has proposed to go further than the existing 40% emissions reduction target for 2030 and increase that to 55%. EU prime ministers and presidents are going to discuss this later today at the European Council taking place in Brussels. We'll see if they reach an agreement on that. It will require a deal on the budget, but I am hearing some positive signs that we will have a compromise that's acceptable there. So I think there's a knock on wood, I think there's a good chance that we're going to see that 2030 target adopted in the next 2 days at this summit happening just next door here. Now, today we're going to talk about how we reach all of these lofty goals, particularly as we look toward what the global situation is, what other countries around the world are doing. Now, we know that businesses and consumers are going to be central to this effort. And the way we produce and consume food, drink, products, all of the things we use in our daily lives, that's really going to be affected by this overarching strategy. So let's talk today about how both consumers and businesses can work toward this goal, how we all have our roles to play, and what the best regulatory framework is, where instead of a linear model where you produce a good, you use it, and then you throw it out, you recycle, you reuse and recycle and readapt products when available. There's obviously some products you can do that with, and other products like food, which are reused in a way, I guess, but that is more of a linear pattern. So we'll talk more about those different consumption patterns here today. And we've assembled a top panel of panelists here to talk about these issues. Let me introduce them now. We have Slovakian MEP Martin Hodzik, MEP from the Renew group of centrists in the European Parliament, and he is also a member of the Environment Committee in the European Parliament. Then we have Christian Holzleitner. He's head of unit for land use and finance for innovation at the European Commission's Climate Department. We have Wendell Trio, director of the NGO Climate Action Network Europe, CAN Europe. We have Eva Tama, senior advisor on international climate change policy for the Global CCS Institute, that's carbon capture and storage. And finally, we have Thomas Lingard, global climate director for multinational consumer goods company Unilever. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today. Before we get started, a couple housekeeping notes. You guys watching at home will have the opportunity to ask your questions to the panelists by using the Q&A feature on Vimeo. That's just to the left of the screen you're watching this on, if you're watching it in Vimeo. I'm going to go ahead and start that Q&A now. So you can start asking your questions right now for the panelists. I will read them out at the end of our discussion to the panelists. It would be great if you can say your name and the organization you're from when you ask your question, but you can also ask anonymously if you like. There's also the chat feature. An important note, don't put your questions in the chat feature because I won't see them. Put your questions in the Q&A feature. The chat feature you can use if you'd like to make a point, maybe an interesting link, a fact that you think would be helpful for the discussion. So questions in the Q&A, statements in the chat. You can also join the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag EADebates right there in front of me. And this session is being recorded. You can watch it later. It will be available on Euractiv's YouTube channel. So let's start with some opening statements from our panelists. I have some opening questions for each of you. Martin, let's start with you because I think you have to duck out for a little bit to go to a vote. Still a work day in the European Parliament today. So Martin, I outlined that businesses and consumers are going to have a role to play here. What do you think businesses and consumers need to do to meet the EU's climate targets?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I think it's really a timely discussion because also it's not the anniversary time, it's also the crunch time. The Council will be deciding on the 2030 target today and tomorrow. Hopefully they agree on an ambitious one, and then they agree on the recovery package as well as the MFF. Now, what it means for businesses and consumers. Let me start with the consumers, or for me, no, just public and people, all of us. One can say, yes, it's about the consumer choices that we do. It's about what products we buy. It's about our lifestyle, and all these are important. But I want to focus on something different. It's about what we ask for from the companies and from the policymakers. These are very important things because the pressure from public did change the European Parliament elections, and actually due to the pressure from public, we have, in my opinion, the Green Deal. We can say that it was because the scientists were calling for action. Sadly, as a policymaker, I have to admit that no, it is because of the public pressure. The second thing is that the public needs to demand from the companies that they start acting. So we saw, and it's from a slightly different point, but it's for me connected. We saw back in the day when, the pesticides were in the fruits and veg from the greenhouses, the public demanded that there is no residues, and it's changed completely within 15 years, the way we do agriculture in greenhouses, and there are almost no more pesticides used. The integrated pest management is all around the place. So it's about the public or consumers, if you want, asking and pressuring the companies to deliver. And I think this is then the motivation for the companies. And it's about the public to pressure the policymakers and administrations to say, hey, I want to renovate my building. What can I do? Where can I get help? Hey, I want to have accessible public transport that I can afford. You want to make as less pollution, give us the tools to actually produce less emissions. So these are the things that the public can do. What the companies can do is, I think there is ahead a unique opportunity, especially for the consumer-oriented companies, to start showcasing the solutions, to start showcasing that they really care and start rethinking their business model so they fit within the planetary boundaries. And that concerns the climate as well as the biodiversity or circular economy. These next 10 years are going to be not crucial, but also really exciting in terms of disruptions. And those who act early are going to be the winners at the end of the day.
Thanks, Martin. I think that's a really good point, that it's not just going to be about consumers changing their consumption patterns, but it's also about political engagement and them actually demanding of both their policymakers and the businesses that they interact with every day that they join in the climate fight. Christian, let's turn to you next. I've mentioned all of the Commission initiatives that have come out over the past year. How much is the Commission relying on businesses to play their part in reaching these net zero targets?
Hi, good morning. Thanks very much for the invitation. Very happy to be here. And to your question, we rely a lot on businesses. Right? Businesses should be the agents of change. And like in particular in climate policy, what the Commission has done with the emission trading system is really bringing the right incentives at the level of the companies. So to reward those companies that are more disruptive, to reward those companies that move out fossil fuels and bring in clean technologies. So this is what the carbon price should do. And now we are also starting the innovation fund. We are putting out this year 1.1 billion euros from the revenues of the emission trading system that we want to give to those companies that for the first time bring innovative clean tech solutions to the market. So already, as I see that Eva is on the panel, so we would be very keen to kick off a European CCS industry for those emissions that we cannot mitigate otherwise. And we are also very happy to see that these more result-based incentives are taking on in agriculture, so that we see with the new common agricultural policy a bigger emphasis on paying out the CAP budget based on delivery of more climate-friendly agriculture, like through the eco schemes. We see there are also a lot of demand from other companies that want to use better our land there to store more carbon in there, in the forests, in the soils. So there is a demand also to use better our natural resources to store more carbon there. And this is also an initiative that we are working on under the Circular Economy Action Plan. How can we better use the CO2 in our soil, in our forests, but then also reuse it and finally store it. So there's a lot of exciting things going on over the next years, and we really hope that we can kick off a new type of economy, that we can set our sight towards 2050. In particular, if we talk more about the food sector, the agriculture sector, these changes take a certain time. We deal with nature here, and so the earlier we can get started, the better. And I think it's very exciting to see how many companies are active, also how many startups, how many young people are investing into a more circular economy, into new ideas for more sustainable food production. So that's very good to see.
Thanks a lot. Let's turn to Wendell Trio next. How do you expect our consumption patterns are going to need to change in order to meet the EU's goals? We've heard there Christian outline all the policy objectives. What do consumers need to do to work hand in hand with that?
Thank you very much, and also thank you for inviting me to this interesting debate. It's very clear that if we are serious about the 1.5 degrees targets of the Paris Agreement, that we need to have everybody on board. We need governments to do their share, businesses to do their share, but obviously we also need to look at how do we change our consumptions and our consumption behavior. Now, as such, that is not a big challenge in the sense that our consumption behavior is changing all the time. If you compare what we're doing now with 5, 10, 20 years ago, it's very clear that this is changing. And the other good part of the good news is that a lot of the changes that would be beneficial for the climate actually also have other co-benefits. Let's think about health. I mean, it's very clear that increasing walking and cycling, for instance, would be is very beneficial for the health of people. Similarly, reducing our meat consumption, which will have a massive impact on carbon emissions, is also much better for human life, etc. Secondly, many of the consumption changes, or pattern changes that we're looking at, would also be very good for our wallet. Do let's think about increasing the sustainability of products, ensuring that they have more quality, a longer life, can better be reused, etc. They all will be beneficial for our expense sheets, let's say. But to conclude, I mean, a number of these changes will need to be made, but they can only be successfully made if we at the same time have consumers engaged in finding the best ways to consume, but also governments and businesses creating the right framework, giving incentives in the right directions, providing only those products that are the most sustainable. So it is actually a combination of measures, but consumption patterns do play an important role.
Eva, let's turn to you next. You're dealing specifically with CCS, which is the technology that could take carbon out of the air and store it underground, essentially. What role can new technologies like CCS play in reducing European emissions?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here. Now, Dave, you asked the question, what role can new technologies like CCS play in reducing European emissions? And I will start with the first part of it, like the new technologies like CCS. It might come as a surprise to parts of the audience, but CCS is actually not a new technology. It has been around since 1970s, 1980s. And there are already facilities up and running all around the world, and you can check the latest global status of CCS reports that we published in the beginning of the month to see where things are globally. But when we look at Europe, we already have two operating facilities in Norway, one from the 90s and the other from early 2000s. So it's not new, but it's very clear that CCS and also other technologies that help to solve the climate problem are definitely having a moment. And it feels like a new coming. And there are new promising projects in the pipeline in Europe because of the Paris Agreement, because of the net zero targets by countries and the net zero targets by businesses. As you see, like there's this huge wave of commitments that are coming forward through the Race to Zero initiative, also cities. And I do agree what was already said here, that it's not only because of the Paris Agreement, it's also because the people are really asking for it. So there's this huge support to go towards net zero. And now when there is that support, obviously there are more constructive discussions about how to actually get there. And obviously what has become apparent is we need all the solutions out there to get there. We cannot pick and choose. We need everyone on board. And CCS is part of that, let's say, portfolio of solutions. And it's a unique solution because it can help to reduce emissions from the industry, be it from the cement or steel production or chemical production or producing low carbon hydrogen. So bringing those emissions down, but then it can also be used to remove carbon from the atmosphere through bioenergy with CCS or direct air capture with CCS. So as we are getting to that net zero and we really need to tackle those residual emissions, it's a set of technologies that can then help on the both sides, bringing the emissions down and then increasing the negative emissions. So clearly the climate neutrality goal in Europe is very, very ambitious. We'll need all solutions, both natural and technological. So I'll leave it here for the introductory remarks. Thanks.
Thanks, Eva. So Thomas, I mean, I mentioned in the opening statement that we're looking ahead to 2050 for that climate neutrality target, but we're also dealing with an interim target in 2030, which EU prime ministers and presidents are going to be discussing today. The 2030 target is kind of halfway there, if you will, or a certain amount of the way there at least. For businesses that are in the consumer goods and food manufacturing sector, which of those targets is more important, the 2030 interim target or the 2050 climate neutrality target?
Thanks, Dave. That's a great question. And people outside the climate space who are watching this debate unfold often ask that question. And the truth is you absolutely need both. And the thing that matters here is not the targets, but limiting global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And you need both the long-term political signal of where we're going, as well as the pathways that get you there. We're talking really about cumulative carbon emissions in the atmosphere, and so it's not only the point at which we reach carbon neutrality, but it's how much carbon and greenhouse gases we emit along the way. And so this very clear signal for net zero is important, because if you only had the reduction target, reduction targets tend to generate incremental solutions. If you set a zero target or a net zero target or a climate neutrality target, you're sending a very clear signal that we're going to need transformational solutions. And it very much drives where and how businesses in every sector invest towards that transition.
Thanks a lot. Let's talk about where we are now in terms of the Green Deal. Martin, you're back with us, thanks. Let me ask you, Martin, first, how do you assess how far we've come in the past year? We've had 1 year of new proposals and this new framework where theoretically every piece of legislation should be compatible with the Green Deal. How have we done so far in the past year, Martin?
Well, there have been some steps forward, and there's been some steps, what we can call backwards. It's not always easy. And I think very good example for that is the agriculture policy. On one hand, we have what I perceive as actually very good and ambitious biodiversity strategy and farm to fork strategy. At the same time, we have the common agriculture policy that's being discussed in the trialogue, that's essentially based on the proposal from the Juncker Commission, and it has not been, so to say, checked, and I don't see it really being fully compatible, to say it modestly, with the European Green Deal and with our climate and biodiversity obligations. And I think this is going to be a challenge to deal with. My hope is that there is quite a bit of space for the member states to do the strategic plans on their own, and this is where I hope they're going to be respecting it more than the current proposal, and we have to evolve that. So it's not perfect. At the same time, we have seen a rapid progress in terms of the climate law. I'm sure that Wendell will be not happy with the 55 that seems to be on the table, and it's 55 net. And I would like to see more as well, and that's what I was pushing in the parliament. But I think at the same time, it is also still a step forward. And I hope that what we'll see at the end of the day, and that's, so to say, the call to the businesses, to public, but also call to our own ranks within the policymakers and civil service, that what we agree in terms of the climate law, I would like us to see to beat that goal. It should be really the minimal, and at the end of the day, showcase in practice that at least 55 net, it's going to turn in reality to 65 gross. And I think this is something which is possible, and this is something where businesses as well as the public can help to lead the way and kind of bolster the confidence of the policymakers that come on. It's really possible to do that.
Well, you mentioned what Wendell thinks. Let's ask Wendell what he thinks. How would you assess the first year of the Green Deal?
Yes, thanks. Well, I think, first of all, it's not so easy to assess it because it's still in an early stage. And what we see, and Martin already gave the example of the common agriculture policy, what we see is that there is not always a full implementation of the big statements into legislation. And there is that kind of challenge that we have. Speak about the 2030 climate target. When Ms. von der Leyen presented her Green Deal, she spoke about an emission reduction target up to 55% by 2030. When we look at what is now actually being proposed by the Commission, it has become a net target, which means it includes both emission reductions and removals, and a bit depending on the success the EU would have in promoting biodiversity and nature restoration, the removals can take up 2 to 5% of the target. So it could be that, in fact, at the end of the day, we are stuck with a 50% target, which is substantially lower than what was promised. And so I think we really need to see and judge the Green Deal on the basis of the final legislation that we get out of all the different processes that have been started up. So in that sense, for me, it's difficult to judge, and definitely a number of good steps have been made, and we've seen, again, as Martin already mentioned, quite ambitious strategies being proposed. But we need to continue being vigilant and ensure that what comes out at the end of the whole Green Deal is really matching the ambitions that we have in terms of the Paris Agreement, in terms of protecting biodiversity, etc. Thank you.
Thomas, from a business perspective, how do you assess the first year of the Green Deal?
Well, I think there's been enormous momentum on this whole subject over the past 12 months, not just in Europe, but around the world. And of course, you know, people often raise competitiveness issues in this discussion. And the fact that you're getting China moving on this, you're getting the US going to move on this, you know, the whole world is moving, and that's creating an environment in which Europe can be much bolder in terms of the targets that it sets without worrying about those kinds of issues. So I'm very optimistic. I mean, you see in the business sector, I think in many ways businesses and many leading European businesses in the food and drink sector running way ahead of regulation at this point. You know, we've got our own targets. We're actually aiming to be zero emissions, not net zero emissions in our own operations by 2030. You've had Nestle come out with a net zero plan this week, Danone doing great stuff. So, you know, right across the industry, people are latching on both to this global ambition to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees and expecting that policy frameworks will ratchet up around the world and are starting to run. So we know this can be done. And we hope that the actions that our sector are taking will bolster the confidence of European policymakers in pushing for the most ambitious set of policy frameworks possible.
Well, Christian, we've just heard some assessments of how the Green Deal has been so far. How do you respond to those assessments?
I think something is really changing. Based on what I said before, we are running the Innovation Fund, where we had our first call for projects for 1 billion, and we got requests for 20 billion. So we are oversubscribed 20 times, and this in COVID times. So there's a huge interest out there from the industry to invest into these new technologies. And it's not only new technologies, it's new business models. And what you also see, you see picking up the sales of electric vehicles. So it's also from the consumer side. I think what people see is that we are proposing of climate-friendly solutions is also good for their quality of life, so that it really pays off 3 times. It pays off for the climate, it pays off for the quality of life, and it pays off for our competitiveness in Europe, as we have a lead in all of these technologies, and we should keep that lead and build on it. And of course, what you see is also that the markets are opening up on that with China. In certain parts of the US, you really see also a huge demand for that, for a more sustainable lifestyle. So I think what is changing there is a lot that like climate change, and I think also the benefits of a more sustainable lifestyle are more and more seen by consumers. And so I think also the way we think about climate policy, it's much less about these are so high additional costs, but it's a solution. It's a solution that can pay off for all of us.
I want to talk about jobs, because new jobs is a big possibility to come out of these climate targets as we look to the green economy. I think this is a good question for Eva. As we look to the new technologies and new developments that are going to be spurred by the climate targets, do you think there's going to be a net gain in EU jobs as a result of the climate targets? And if so, how would that come about?
Well, what we do know for sure is that these changes will create jobs in all the industries that are changing within, and also the new industries that are being developed. If you take an example of carbon capture and storage, which can be used in certain parts of Europe, also in the context of just transition, then one of the biggest challenges there is you have a location where you have jobs, and you probably want to create jobs in the same location if there's going to be a change, because we've seen historically where there have been, let's say, mining towns that where the industry goes away, suddenly the jobs are gone. So here there is an opportunity. For example, if you have an industry and you would retrofit a plant, be it steel production with CCS, you would keep the jobs in the same area. If we create new jobs, obviously where you would retrofit CCS or create new plants. And the good thing is also that all these jobs that are being created tend to be very high value jobs. These are jobs for people who earn well, and that's also something very, very important to bear in mind. For example, IEA's sustainable development scenario shows that globally for CCS, as we need more than 2,000 facilities by 2050, it would be at least 100,000 employees. And that's just one set of technologies, because there's going to be a lot happening in other industries as well. So there is definitely a big opportunity here, and just it's a question of how to do it in a smart way, in a just way, in a way that you are very closely working with the regions and in areas that are mostly affected by these changes.
Thomas, we often hear from the business community the risks of economic sacrifice or an economic damage from climate action. On the flip side, do you think there are economic opportunities from the EU's climate targets?
Absolutely, and I think the sort of arguments you talked about, you tend to hear from old 20th century industries that are rightly worried about their future. I think that we've got to end this false dichotomy of kind of can we fix climate change or can we have an economy? I mean, it's a completely false dichotomy. We're talking here about a new industrial revolution, a low carbon, zero carbon industrial revolution that is going to be good for growth, good for jobs, good for business, and as other panelists have said, good for people's quality of life, which is ultimately what the economy should be delivering: better quality of life, more prosperity for people in Europe and across the world. I think we've seen reports from McKinsey recently showing that with kind of capital and infrastructure investment in countries of between 75 and 150 billion, you could get up to 3 million new jobs in these new sectors. This is an extremely exciting transition, and as of course of others have said, any transition comes with social impacts, and they have to be managed sensitively and upfront, not as an afterthought. And the kind of work that we've been doing with groups like the B team on looking at just transition and how that's built into these policy measures are critical to this succeeding.
Christian, let me put the question. Thomas made a point there about old 20th century industries being concerned about job loss. So let me put these two questions to you, Christian. On one hand, does the Commission believe that the climate targets are going to create new jobs, but at the same time, are they also going to result in the loss of other jobs, let's say in the coal mining industry, for instance? Is the Commission preparing for those two scenarios, and can one make up for the other?
I think we definitely see a net gain in jobs. So pretty much also along the lines of the McKinsey study. And while Eve was highlighting technology jobs, maybe I want to refer also to the large potential in the building sector. So we are currently renovating 1% of our buildings. In our scenarios, we would move up to a renovation rate of 2% of our building stock per year. So that creates a huge potential. And there we should also look like for innovative solutions. How can we better use, for example, wooden construction material, so that we also in our houses store carbon and take CO2, so to say, out of the air by that. So there are many exciting possibilities for a more regional, decentralized economy. But of course, and this is, I think, one of the big mottos of these commissions, we don't want to leave anyone behind. There are regions that will be more affected by the transition than others, and these regions should be supported, that they immediately go to where we want them to be, with a more sustainable industry. And I think this now is a very unique opportunity that we've never had in climate policy up to now. And also here in this discussion, we've always talked about regulation, which types of targets will be set and so on. But that's only the one side of the coin. Now we have, with the Recovery and Resilience Facility, a unique opportunity to finance into our future and to really change our energy system, our industrial system for the next 100 years. I mean, we are really changing the energy source from fossil to renewable, to more circular, and so on. And with the Recovery and Resilience Facility, we have a big pot of money at our hand. And the Lighthouse projects are rightly about climate and digital. And so if we use the money well that we have now at our hands, that the member states have with their recovery plans, we can really make a big difference. And in view of all the investments that we are seeing over the next 30 years in our scenarios, I'm not worried about the job situation.
Martin, what's your take on this? Do you think the EU is offering enough assistance to businesses to make this transition?
Well, I'm quite optimistic about it, and I think there is enough support. There always can be more, but it's about how we use it, and also whether we don't put money in the wrong direction, whether we don't create stranded assets by investing into fossil infrastructure that we will have to write off very soon. And this is something where I believe we need to use taxonomy. I had the honor to be the shadow on the file, and I think it's really important one that goes beyond, and the utility of it goes beyond the private investment. I think it's a good guide for the private investors, but it's also something that should guide, as a set of rules, the public spending, and at least on the level of coherency should apply the do no harm principle, and direct within the green investment that the kind of the investments linked to the Green Deal be following the taxonomy as a principle that helps us to identify where to put the money. Because you can say there is never going to be enough money, but also in some ways, I believe it's such a good business opportunity that this is an opportunity for private investors, and the state should have more a supporting role, helping maybe to create the right infrastructure in terms of the grids for electricity, for example. And last but not least, let me not forget to stop the harmful subsidies. So it's not only about whether we give money for the right things, but to make sure that we don't use public resources for the wrong things, like subsidies of fossil fuels, where, yes, we need to address the energy poverty, but the best way to address it is energy efficiency, making sure people have good jobs, and moving people to efficient and renewable energy sources.
Wendell, I know that climate campaigners often bristle when the business community complains about the costs of the energy transition, saying that those concerns are overblown. What's your take on what Martin was just talking about the use of EU funds? Let's take, certainly in particular, the Just Transition Fund. Is the EU right now wisely channeling funds for this purpose to help regions and businesses in the transition, or is there a risk that this money is used to lock in fossil fuels technologies?
So first of all, yes, I do think that there is at the moment with the new EU budget and the new recovery package, and let's assume everything goes well and this can go through, I think there is a substantial amount of money that is being provided to help make the transition from where we are now to a better future. And maybe just before I go on to that, let me also stress that business as usual doesn't exist. If we don't stop climate change, it will also have a disastrous impact both on the economy and on jobs. So it needs to be clear that we're looking also at a very different picture if we don't act. Now, there's a lot of money being set aside. 30% of the EU budget and recovery package should be dedicated to climate action, and the other 70% should not do significantly harm. And I think there's still a bit of a challenge if we look at how governments, but also the members of the European Parliament are kind of having the debate around the use of this money and whether there's enough guarantees that the 30% that is being put aside for climate action will indeed have no fossil fuels in it, and secondly, whether the 70% will do the same. And in that sense, we're happy that for the moment it seems that at least the Just Transition Fund will not support any fossil fuel activities, and in particular, there has been a pressure to include gas projects. For us, it would be inconceivable that you have the concept of a just transition, which means transitioning away from fossil fuels towards the alternatives that would include support to gas. So progress on the Just Transition Fund, still concerns about the rest, and we will need some level of vigilance, both from civil society, but also from the European Commission, the European Parliament, to ensure that the promises that are made are really being enacted, and that we can use this money for what it's really meant, which is the transition towards a better future.
Eva, let me get you to respond to that, Eva, because I know that CCS is often used as a justification for building gas infrastructure, saying, the promise of CCS that we could, even gas plants that are built today, would be able to then lower their climate impact by using CCS. So do you think that CCS is a good option for the EU in terms of investment toward the energy transition?
Well, if you look at how the EU is going about the policy making in this front, and Christian, I'm sure, knows it very well as well, the role of CCS is seen as using it to abate those emissions that cannot be tackled otherwise, right? So we are not here talking about anymore still producing coal, for example, coal and retrofitting those plants with CCS, because coal phase out is happening in some countries faster than others, but I mean that's clearly taking place. And then there are I think if you look more broadly, then under the Green Deal, one of the challenges is that you have such a big overarching goal where you have to bring together so many different policies. And now, just from the CCS perspective, making it clear that it's the same way tackled by the taxonomy and under the ETS, and the funding streams, be the innovation fund or through the projects of common interest, or how it's incorporated into the new regulation. It's just making sure that it is used in the situations where it makes most sense, and where it really delivers those emission reductions, or at some cases also carbon removals. So I feel like sometimes it still comes up in this CCS pro fossil something, and then there is another side, but that's not how we see it. It's just a technology that is needed to tackle those emissions that can't really be tackled otherwise, and then there is negative emissions, which is a separate part of the picture, but obviously we'll need to prioritize emission reductions. But what also comes to play when you talk about gas is obviously producing low carbon hydrogen, And here we'll need to see, very likely, we'll need all all types of low carbon hydrogen. In the beginning, it's clear that the one produced through carbon capture and storage is going to be cheaper, and there's going to be this game of chicken and an egg, the demand and supply, and how to build it up. And then once we have enough build out of renewables, we might have more green hydrogen. But you have to start building it up with all the options, and then we'll see how the technologies advance, how the prices go, how the market evolves, and yeah, let it take us where we need to go.
Well, let's take some questions from the audience. We've had a lot come in. Thanks, guys, for that. I'll take this first question from Kai Polak. This is going to go to Christian, I think. Kai asks, will public procurement processes be adapted to focus more on sustainability rather than price? This has been a big debate because obviously municipalities are first and foremost thinking about price, and that can sometimes come at the detriment of the greenest choice. Christian, what's the Commission doing on that?
Yes, green procurement is a big topic for the Commission. Also first in our own procurement actions. Of course, there is a tension with of course the principle of the best of the least cost offer. There are already now in the existing framework options how to go for more greener products to put this in. So this is a lot also from member states how they transpose our relevant directives there. We should definitely go into this direction. Something that we are also considering at. Am I lost? Okay.
Are you? Yeah.
Yes. Am I back?
Yes.
I disappeared for a minute. Okay. Yes. Something interesting that we are also considering here to look into is what we call carbon contracts for difference. So how could you give a premium for green steel, for green hydrogen? How could you calculate that? How could you set up maybe European-wide markets for that? And I think this is also something where we could support this idea of green procurement.
Thomas, let me put this question to you. I mean, when you guys are dealing with public procurement issues, have you noticed this changing at all, that more of a focus on sustainability rather than price?
Well, we're not a huge supplier into public procurement, but I can maybe talk from our own experience as a procurer of many raw materials, that we've joined a group called the 1.5 Supply Chain Leaders. So this is companies who've both set their own net zero or 1.5 aligned targets and are now working with their supply base to encourage them to set the same targets. So we definitely see this as a trend. The International Chamber of Commerce has also launched an SME climate hub to ensure that this isn't just a big company conversation, but that small and medium-sized enterprises around the world can also access tools and resources to start this transition to net zero. So I am absolutely convinced that public procurement will be part of this game, and will need to be driving this through the levers of power and influence that they control through the very significant spend.
Let's take a next question. This one is for Martin. It comes from Mohammed the rest of the name is cut off, Albeld something. So he asks, to enable consumers to have an effective role, there needs to be public awareness and education to enable their efforts. Martin, what can the EU do to really communicate to citizens what they need to do and to facilitate their actions?
Well, on one hand, yes, it's about having public awareness campaigns, spreading the information about the seriousness of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. And it's about really fostering the dialogue also in the media. I agree with that. But I think it's not only about what the EU can do in a proactive information. It's about also the overall discussion that we help to create in the society, and all about setting the right framework for the consumer. It's it's not for me just kind of talking about informing consumer and enabling consumer choice. It's about making sure that the consumer actually on the price tag has the real price. So it's about bringing in the externalities. The previous speakers mentioned kind of the premium for the green steel as an example, and I think this is for me, or green procurement. These are for me important elements. One thing is, it should not be necessarily about premium. If we're talking about the free market competition and all these buzzwords, then let's have the real price. Let's bring in the externalities. Let's really make the polluter pays principle true in the practice. And then suddenly we'll start seeing that the products that have lower impact on the planet are cheaper. Second, it's about achieving the economies of scale. And here, I think that what would help more than kind of doing, from my point of view, often very boring and unengaging information campaigns that the EU is doing, putting the money where the mouth is and really making sure that the procurement is fulfilling the green criteria, not as something which is a premium, but as an obligation, because not just the union, it's not about the commission, it's the bulk is the states, the local municipalities. If we see the public money going to buying sustainable products and services, and that's not only about products, it's also about services, then we suddenly see the economies of scale. The public money is a massive driver in the market, and if we put it where we want it to be in terms of sustainability, then it's going to make a big difference.
Wendell, let me put the same question to you. How do you think consumers can be made better aware of the actions that they can take to help this process?
Well, I think this is obviously both a challenge and an opportunity. I think there's already a lot of things happening in terms of awareness raising by work that NGOs and movements, and think about the youth movement, is doing, but a lot more can be done. The question mark will be, or there's definitely a limitation to what governments can do in terms of awareness raising, because they're not necessarily the best messenger. And here I believe that also NGOs and civil society can play an important role in creating more awareness. And this is something where both the European Commission as well as national governments could work much closely with NGOs and with civil society movements that really work on the ground to help them in further increasing awareness, in providing the right kind of information, in giving examples of what people can do to contribute to the solution. So I do believe that there's a lot of things to be done, but it doesn't necessarily need to be done by the authorities themselves. They can work together and support civil society to do that.
Okay, we have another question here from Mohammed Al-Beldawi. Sorry, the typing is really small there. It's hard for me to read. This is a question to Eva. So to go to net zero is very promising and ambitious, but is it achievable? Should we realistically name it near zero? Because of course, I think this is a good question for Eva, because CCS is a big part of how this whole net zero concept works, that we get close to completely reducing emissions, and any remainder is made up for by abatement projects and sequestering projects. So whatever carbon is left, you take out of the atmosphere in one way or the other, and there's lots of ways to do that. CCS is one. So do you think, Eva, that true net zero is feasible?
Well, this is the goal, right? We're on a path there, and we will see if we get there. But in terms of math, yes, this is what we have in mind. net zero is the point where you have balanced out the residual emissions with removals. And I guess the idea of near zero may come from, I can only imagine it from two sides. One is that, okay, we haven't actually been able to bring the emissions down enough to be able to balance them with removals, or maybe the person who asked the question is not really thinking about removals and is only looking at emissions, and it's clear that we cannot bring to zero all emissions. Like we have agriculture, we have aviation, there are going to be emissions left that have to be tackled. But also bear in mind that net zero is only one specific point in time, and it's on the path, and then we will go forward and we will need to have negative emissions after that. And this is often something that is lost or doesn't maybe get enough attention. It's not only about net zero, but also for everything that comes after that, and we need to prepare for that. And as we have discussed, there are like so many different solutions that will need to be used, and we cannot really pick and choose, because then we will just decrease the likelihood of getting to net zero and to negative emissions.
Wendell, let me also put this question to you. I think among the public there is some confusion about what net zero means versus an absolute reduction or some other concepts. And I certainly do hear some skepticism about the net zero concept, because it could also involve abatement activities in other countries and just kind of spreading the emissions elsewhere. How do you view the net zero concept?
Well, I think the net zero is an interesting concept in that it kind of identifies that we need to reduce our emissions as much as possible, but at the same time also need to increase the removal capacity of our ecosystems to take up CO2 from the air. And as Eva said, the ultimate goal must be to go to what is called net negative emissions, so that we actually take up more carbon from the atmosphere than we emit. Now, it's important that those are two relatively separate processes that they put together in the net concept, but we should keep in mind that we need to approach them very differently. And emission reductions, so purely ensuring that we have less and less CO2 and other greenhouse gases being emitted by industrial processes, by the energy production, by the use of fossil fuels, agriculture, etc. That's one thing, and there we need to go to the ultimate maximum that we can do. And yes, there might be a number of emissions that we can't fully abate, but they should be reduced to the absolute minimum. And at the same time, but in a parallel process, we should increase the capacity of our ecosystems to take up carbon from the air, through protecting our forests, through restoring peatlands and wetlands. And I mean, there's many different things that can be done, and it's very important that we do the two at the same time, and that we don't put one against the other. And that's a bit what's happening with the 2030 target. The more we increase our biodiversity, the less we would need to reduce our emissions to get to the net 55% target. And that should not be the case. We should act on both as strongly and as ambitious as we can.
Eva, do you want to come back on this point, particularly on offsetting emissions in other countries?
Yes, because you brought it up as something that often also comes up in these net zero discussions. And I think here, and given that I'm working on the international climate policy side and also looking at what's happening outside Europe, the world that we are moving towards is where all the countries have their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, where that are increasingly economy-wide, covering all sectors. And then any kind of trading between countries under the Paris rules would result in not having any kind of double counting. So if someone sells their emissions to another country, they will need to remove them from their own country's inventory. Or so basically, we are at the place where there's still a bit of a gray area about what is covered by whose targets. We have country targets, we have business targets, we have voluntary markets, we have compliance markets. But after all, the world towards which we are moving is that we are really counting to all these emissions, and we have systems in place through the collaborations that is taking place now to make sure that we all know what is actually within the targets, and there is nothing that is just sent away somewhere and somehow you get this magical offsets on your account, but they don't really appear as to be left another destination.
Thomas, how are companies interpreting the net zero concept?
Well, I can't speak for all companies, but I would certainly fully endorse what Wendell just said. It's really critical that we hold on to the decarbonisation pathway as a thing in its own right, and the carbon sequestration actions as a slightly separate thing. I appreciate they come together sometimes in net zero targets and for companies and for countries, but underneath that, it's critical not to lose sight of the fact that we just won't get to net zero in any shape or form without significant dramatic cuts in emissions and preferably forward-weighted cuts in emissions, right? As I said at the beginning, this is about cumulative emissions. So the more that we can take out of the system early on, the easier this transition is going to be. You know, there simply isn't enough land to be planting trees to sequester carbon, or even the CCS technology scaled up to 100 times what we've got today isn't going to scratch the surface of sequestering the total business as usual emissions pathway that we're on. So we're going to need both radical decarbonisation in every part of the economy and a scale up in both natural and technological solutions that can sequester greenhouse gas emissions.
Thanks. Let's take another question from the audience. This one is for Christian. It's coming from Riley Kajaste Rudnitskaya. Sorry, again, the lettering is really small on people's names, so I think I'm butchering some of them. How do you see the development of the carbon price in the ETS? This is an element we haven't talked about yet, but it is really central to the EU's decarbonization tools. It's kind of the chief tool in the toolbox, and the carbon price has been an issue over the past 10 years. So, Christian, we've had efforts from the Commission to fix the carbon price issue. How do you see the development going forward?
We are now at a carbon price at around 30 euros, which is compared to some years ago where we were at 5 euros, a very big change. And I think what we are seeing is a trust in the carbon markets. We see many more traders, actors coming back. We have a lot more liquidity, and we hope that with the new proposals in June next year, we can take further measures to strengthen the carbon market signal, the price, and but I think that there are now very solid expectations around the carbon price, because what maybe even matters more is not the current carbon price, but the expectations that companies have what the carbon market price will be in 10 years or 20 years, because this is what is driving investments, and some of these investments are very long term in renewables, in new wind farms, and so on. This is the energy, the electricity that we will have for the next 50 years. So I think we are very happy to see this bigger confidence in the carbon market, and we continue to see it as a key tool ongoing for the decarbonization. So for this one part, to get out the fossil fuels and to create the place for all the new technologies.
Does anyone else have a thought on this ETS and carbon price issue? Yes, Wendell?
Yes, just to support what Christian just said, I think what is important is indeed the expectations of companies of what the carbon price will be. Important to note that if we really want to make the transition that we need, that the carbon price will need to be substantially high. And you might have noted that the European Investment Bank uses a shadow price when they consider their projects. And their proposal is to increase their shadow price to 250 euros per ton by 2030. So they're really looking at a substantial increase. But at the same time, it is crucial to note that the price alone is not sufficient. I mean, it's one of the elements, but we also need many other actions, because in certain sectors, the price will not be the most important element of making decisions. And there we also need regulatory measures. So it is important that we keep both sides of the coin, price signal, market signal, but also regulatory measures.
Thomas, I know you're on a task force about scaling up carbon markets. What are your thoughts on the ETS and the price?
Well, we've been long advocates for measures which will raise the carbon price over time, and many of you will have seen the report from the Global Commission on Carbon Prices that says we need to be aiming for somewhere around $100 a tonne by the end of the decade. So consistent policy signals that show that we're heading in that direction will certainly help. On the carbon markets point more broadly, yes, I am serving on this task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets. It does attract some controversy, and I think, rightly, NGOs will be concerned, and all of us will be concerned, that if there is going to be a global carbon market with carbon reductions effectively being transferred out of one place to other parts of the world, that those emissions reductions have very high integrity and proper environmental social protections around where that money is flowing and what it's doing. But there will be a role for those kinds of credits, particularly when we think about the world's tropical forests. Once those forests are gone, we're not going to get them back. So it is important to think systemically about how we navigate this transition pathway, and how we ensure that we don't lose assets that are storing huge amounts of carbon that once they're gone will be just impossible to get back.
Well, certainly there's a lot of different facets to this journey toward carbon neutrality and a lot of different tools in the toolbox, and each of them could get their own debate. But now we're heading toward the end of the event, so I want to get some concluding thoughts from each of you. Let's start with Christian. Christian, what are your key takeaways from today's debate?
Maybe I come back a little bit on the voluntary carbon markets and the additional actions that we need there on the carbon removals. As Eve also said, there we must get much better at removing carbon from the atmosphere, because this is what we need at the end. Net zero is just a step. It's just a step in the process to a new type of economy, and we see. I think, as I also said in my initial statement, we see a lot of interest from companies to become also net zero, to become climate neutral. And a lot of them are using credits from the voluntary markets. And there are concerns about the quality of these credits. So we really want to get in there from the side of the Commission. So this is one of the actions from the Circular Economy Action Plan, is to create an EU standard for the certification of carbon removal credits, so that we really get a better quality signal on that 1 ton of carbon is 1 ton of carbon. So that really, if somebody tells you that through afforestation and so on, 1 ton of carbon will be stored in the forests, that this is really an additional and permanent action, so that you really know what you are paying for and that you can pay a fair price for that. And I think that will be a particularly important policy development. And I think not only for the tropical forests, but for us in the first place, for Europe, that we get better incentives for our own foresters, farmers, that they get a fair remuneration when they get more climate friendly, and that we get the incentives right for a much better use of our land, because I think this will be one of the biggest questions when we go towards 2050. When we go towards 2050, we will need to talk much more about the bioeconomy, because this will be the source of the CO2 that we then also still need for our industry. And so I think this is a very interesting debate that we should soon start going. And yeah, I'll end on that.
Thanks. Martin, what are your key takeaways from today?
It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be very, very exciting. And I think one very key message is it's great to hear that it's really about discussion how we're going to get there, how we're going to make it happen, and not any more discussions whether, if it's possible, feasible, or how, whether it's actually needed. And it might sound like something almost, obvious, but yeah, there are parts of Europe where this is still happening. There sadly are circles where this is still happening. And for me, this is about question not if we can afford it. This is a question about whether we can afford not to do that. And I'm pretty convinced that the scientists are right. And my experience with the science is that actually they are always a bit extra cautious. And I kind of hope that we will not just talk, but we will act, and that we will start seeing the changes on the ground. We need to be very careful in order not to do, and the discussion highlighted today, not to do double accounting, not to do greenwashing, not to have a side effects that we cannot afford, not to pretend that we put the carbon in the ground just because we planted some trees that we later on chop down and burn as a biomass and pretend that it's renewable, because it's should have been staying there. But also that there is lots of appetite and lots of interest in innovating and really rolling the change out. So I would say that not that I'm optimistic, but I'm hopeful. And I think that we need to now transform this into real action in a just and an equitable way.
Wendell, let's go to you next. What are your concluding thoughts?
Well, it's very clear that the today and tomorrow is extremely important, and we hope that leaders can make the right decisions on the 2030 climate target and come up with the most ambitious expression possible. It's important because it will kind of strongly impact two processes. One is the preparation by the Commission of the so-called Fit for 55 package, the whole set of legislations that they plan to propose in the middle of next year, which really will define how much and how quickly the EU and its member states will take action. And I think the target is, of course, extremely important, but much more important is what we do with it and how do we actually reduce emissions starting from day one. Because as has been said before, short-term actions is really, really crucial. The second big influence it has is, well, on Saturday we have the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement, where countries will come together. It's the kind of the only climate summit we have this year due to the COVID pandemic, and we see some positive signs in the international community. And I think if the EU can come with a new 2030 target, it will actually strengthen that positive atmosphere there is, and it might incentivize all the other big emitters and all the other countries in the world to actually increase the ambition overall to ensure we come closer to the 1.5 degrees target of the Paris Agreement.
Eva, what are your key takeaways?
Thanks, Dave. Well, first of all, I wanted to say that I totally agree with what Wendell said about the carbon price and ETS. It's something that's very necessary, but indeed it is not everything, and it doesn't always work for every sector. And I'm saying that because I'm often getting the question, so what will the carbon price need to be to make CCS happen? And there's so many answers to it because the prices are different and the solutions are different. But the truth is that it's not a universal thing. We need a high carbon price for sure, but it's not one thing that fixes everything. We need this and many, many other solutions as well. But I just wanted to kind of reflect, we were going into this event trying to take stock of what has been happening this year and kind of looking forward. And I see that it has been a good, very, very productive year. It's very clear that we need all hands on deck to get to climate neutrality. We need all stakeholders on board. We need all solutions, in the mix. And I think next year is going to be even more busy on the policy side. We are looking at the new proposals on the sectoral climate policies. Christian mentioned the certification for carbon removals, which is so important because there are now numerous solutions where we don't really have commonly, broadly, internationally agreed accounting rules. So if the EU can start figuring it out, I can see it's really working also much more broadly globally at some point, I hope. So I'm just really looking forward to the next year and the year after and the year after. These are going to be very exciting times, and I hope we will get on the right path very quickly.
Thanks. And finally, Thomas, what are your concluding thoughts?
Well, I think if we take a step back, to even just back to 2015, the idea that we would have all been sat here now discussing whether the targets were going to be 50, 55, 60%, we might not have believed that was possible, but look how far we've come in terms of our understanding of what's necessary and our understanding of what's doable. And I'm pretty sure that when we get to 2028, 2029, we won't believe that we were sat here today with such low levels of ambition. I think this is going to snowball. So I'm very optimistic. I'm really encouraged by the fact that it looks like we are going to get this 55% today. I'm sure it will go up over the next, decade and beyond as people, come together around this challenge. And as has been said today, this isn't a kind of government or business or civil society. This is everybody together, aligning around the same goal and thinking through some of the challenges about how we now get on and deliver this.
Well, thanks, Thomas, and thanks to all the panelists for some great insights. Also, thanks for you at home for some great questions and for following along with us today. We'll have to leave it there, but this will, as you've all mentioned, this is going to be a key thing to watch today and tomorrow at the EU summit taking place here in Brussels. We'll see what happens with that 2030 targets. So thanks again for watching, and we will see you here next time for the next Euractiv debate.